Hey there, laugh your way to bliss, subscribe for uproarious jokes and endless hilarity.
One of the matrons of the church was cooking a pot of her famous beans for the church potluck. Her son, little Johnny, came running through the house, BB gun in one hand, and a handful of BBs in the other. He tripped and the BBs, naturally, went right into the pot of beans. Thinking it over, little Johnny could think of no reason why he should risk punishment, so he said nothing. The dinner went well, and, as usual, the beans were one of the most popular dishes. The next day, the church secretary, Mary, called little Johnny's mother and said, "Jane, your beans were delicious as usual, but what did you put in them this time?" Jane replied, "Nothing new, why do you ask?" "Well," said Mary, "this morning I bent over to feed the cat, and shot the canary." A young couple took their little boy to the doctor. With some hesitation, they explained that, although their son appeared to be in good health, they were concerned about his rather small penis. After examining the child, the doctor could find no reason for it. However, the mother continued her search and, after weeks of asking around, got to an old wise woman who everyone swears knows more strange cures than anyone alive. "Feed him pancakes," she declares it immediately. "People won't believe it, but it'll solve your problem." The next morning, when the boy arrived at breakfast, there was a large stack of warm pancakes in the middle of the table. "Gee, Mom!" he exclaimed. "For me? Just take two," his mother replied. "The rest are for your father."
After Mrs. Grandapple found out her husband was sterile, the couple decided to hire a proxy father. After Mrs. Grandapple found out her husband was sterile, the couple decided to hire a proxy father to start their family. On the day the proxy father was to arrive, Mr. Grandapple kissed his wife and said, "I'm off to work, Lydia. The guy should be here soon." Wouldn't you know it, a door-to-door baby photographer came by half an hour later, hoping to make a sale? Mrs. Grandapple answered the door. "Good morning, ma'am. You don't know me, but I've come to." "Oh yes, I know why you're here. Harry told me you'd be coming soon." "He did? But Come right in. No use wasting time." "Very well, then." The photographer took out his briefcase and sat down. "As you may already know, I've made a specialty of babies." "Good, I'm glad," said Mrs. Grandapple. "That's just what Harry and I were looking for. I usually like to try two in the bathtub, one on the couch, and perhaps a couple on the bed," said the photographer. "The living room floor is fun too. You can really spread out. Bathtub? Living room floor? No wonder it never worked for Harry and me." "Well, ma'am, none of us can guarantee a perfect one every time, but if we try several different positions and I shoot from 6 or 7 different angles, I think you'll be quite pleased with the results." "I certainly hope we can get this over with quickly," Mrs. Grandapple gasped nervously. "Ma'am, in my line of work, a man must take his time. I'd like to be in and out in 5 minutes, but you'd be disappointed with that, I'm sure." "Don't I know," breathed Mrs. Grandapple. The photographer pulled out a portfolio of his pictures. "This one was done on top of a bus in downtown London," he said, showing Mrs. Grandapple the picture. "Oh my God!" exclaimed Mrs. Grandapple, tugging on her handkerchief. "And these twins turned out exceptionally well when you consider the fact that their mother was so difficult to work with." He showed Mrs. Grandapple another picture. "She was difficult?" questioned Mrs. Grandapple. "Extremely," said the photographer. "I finally had to take her to Hyde Park to get the job done right. People were crowding around, 4 and 5 deep, just to get a good look." 4 and 5 deep. Mrs. Grandapple was amazed. "Yes," said the photographer. "And for more than 3 hours, too. The mother was constantly squealing and yelling. I could hardly concentrate. Then it started getting dark, and I had to rush my shots. Finally, when the squirrels started nibbling on my equipment, I just packed it all in. Mrs. Grandapple leaned forward. You mean the squirrels actually chewed on your, equipment? Yes, ma'am. Thank God, no real damage was done. Well, we'll get to work as soon as I set up my tripod. Mrs. Grandapple looked extremely worried now. Of course. I need to use a tripod to rest my cannon on. It's much too big for me to hold while I'm getting ready for action. Ma'am? Good God, she's fainted. Captain Burntwood is an officer in the Union Army. One day, his unit gets overrun by an overwhelming ambush by the Confederate Army. He is captured and taken to a Confederate garrison, where he is brought up to General Scamelot. To his surprise, he is greeted warmly and served a sumptuous lunch and aged bourbon by his captors. I'm sorry, Captain Burntwood, but we cannot let you go. General Scamelot says you are responsible for the deaths of so many of my men. But we do respect your abilities and what you do for the love of your country, so we will make sure you are comfortable and well treated. But tomorrow, you face the firing squad but will be given the due honors befitting an officer's death. Do you have any last wishes? Captain Burntwood puts down his glass of bourbon and says, I do. Let me speak with my horse. Intrigued by this request, General Camelot leads him out to the stables. Captain Burntwood takes the horse by the reins and whispers into its ears. The horse whinnies and trots out towards the gate. Still intrigued, General Scamelot waves off the guard that tries to stop the horse, and the horse walks out of the garrison. 2 hours later, the horse returns with a lovely lady on it. Captain Burntwood cries out and embraces his wife. Quickly understanding, and much nudge, wink with his fellow Confederates, General Scamelot welcomes the captain's wife and proclaims that he too is married and completely understands. Sorry about tomorrow, but they may make generous use of his very own quarters. The couple spends the night at the general's quarters, and, come dawn, Captain Burntwood is paraded onto the grounds, where a squad of soldiers are loading their rifles. A priest prays with the captain, and then he is brought to the general. Captain, have you any last words? The general asks. I do, General Scamelot, but I would say it to my horse. Captain Burntwood says at the general's assenting nod. Captain Burntwood walks up to his horse, grabs it by the ears, and screams, Posse. I said, bring me my posse.